Of the three, really. Thanks a lot for inviting me to come. It's a lot of fun, actually. The second remark is, actually, Lena and Maria asked me to present a paper, just not do a lecture, but present research. But as you notice, this is research with Thomas Domen, Melanie Camis, and Norberto Pignati, and from very different places in the world, as you can see. The point is, it's still preliminary work. So it's not, because as John rightly said, if you have a perfectly finished paper, what's the point of presenting this? So, so some things we have worked on for a long time, other things we have not, actually. So not everything is perfect here, for sure. Now, let me also say, and this relates to what John said this morning, when my daughter was very young, I read her fairy tales from Oscar Wilde, in German actually, not in English. And after a very short period of time, she fell asleep. And the point is, my wife always claims that I have this monochordic voice. So, and this is probably true, and I've tried to get over this, but I've never been able to do this. So, so essentially, this is not an indication that I'm not interested in what I'm doing, and it's not an indication that I don't want you to be interested in what we're doing here. Okay. So the topic is, as you see, risk attitudes, informal employment, and wages in Ukraine, which I think is a new topic, which has not really, the way we do it, been done in the literature. And the underlying assumption of this work is that the informal sector, informal employment, is riskier for the individual than the formal sector or formal employment. Potential reasons, risk of detection and punishment. There are no benefits since you're not covered by social insurance regarding illness and or old age. Also, you might be fired immediately. There's no employment protection and so on. The second underlying assumption would be that individuals who voluntarily choose the sector might be more willing to take risks, while individuals who are involuntary in this sector, and we do have data where we can distinguish between involuntary and voluntary informal employment, might not be more willing to take risks since they're not there by choice. So our main research questions, and again, it's not just one question, but they are connected though, so I think it's okay to have more than one question, but the fundamental question is though, do individuals who are more willing to take risk have a higher propensity to engage in informal employment? And linking risk attitudes to labor market states, what does this tell us about the nature of informal employment? So there's the debate, is this voluntary, involuntary? Are people pushed into it, or are they selecting themselves voluntarily into it? And also, what does it tell us about the structure of the labor market? Is it integrated or segmented along the formal-informal divide? We also look at residual earnings. So we do basically Mincer regressions and then take residuals and see whether individuals who are willing to take risks select themselves into sectors with a larger variance in residual earning. And the last question, which we really have just started to look at, is search behavior of the unemployed related to risk attitudes. Essentially, how long you wait in the state of unemployment, whether you exit into informal employment or you wait till you get an offer in the formal sector. Those are questions that, this is a question that we also want to address here. Now let me talk a little bit about the literature, and basically there are two areas of the literature I'm interested in, the informality literature and the literature that we already know or that already exists and that's quite large, that looks at risk attitudes and life outcomes, also labor market outcomes. So this slide essentially talks about definitions, how to define informality in the labor market. And I mean, it's not a caricature, but it's a bit schematic, but that's okay to get our thoughts right, I think. So the ILO uses often productive, and also the World Bank, because of lack of data often, uses the productivity definition. So basically, informality is characterized mainly by job characteristics. So non-professionals, unskilled, marginal jobs, the self-employed, domestic and family workers, and workers in small firms with up to 5 employees are often subsumed under the category informal employment. Then we have a legalistic social protection definition, which basically characterizes informality in the labor market by non-compliance to the state regarding labor laws and social security systems. So waged workers and the self-employed, not compliant or without access, I mean, it might be involuntarily, so without access to the social security system or pension system, with no registration or contract. Now we avoid conceptual fuzziness, because sometimes people put this all sort of together, by adhering strictly to the legalistic social protection definition, which one might be critical about, of course. So basically we have informal wage employment or salaried employment means no contract for the employment relationship. And informal self-employment, there is no registration of the economic activity with the state. We will see how we, later when we talk about the data, how we elicit the information on that. Now, again, this is very schematic in a way, but I think it helps us focus a bit our thought. Of course, there is this long going on debate about whether in developing countries especially, but also in developed countries, we have labor market segmentation. Essentially, some people are rationed out of the formal labor market, and especially where you don't have unemployment benefit systems that are highly developed, like we have in Europe, basically have to park, so to speak, in the informal sector until they eventually can enter the formal labor market, if ever. Or, but it could also be a voluntary choice. I choose, given my skills, my utility is higher, choosing an informal employment relationship. So we have, if you like, 3 main schools of thought about informal employment in developing countries. So the traditional school, going back to Lewis, if you like, and certainly Harris and Todaro, where the labor market is segmented. Then John talked about De Soto quite a bit. So we have a revisionist school, if you like, that goes back actually not just to De Soto, but also Rosenzweig in earlier papers. But the guy pushing for this very much recently is Maloney from the World Bank, where basically we have this paradigm where the labor market is integrated. And over my life cycle or working cycle, I might choose different segments of the labor, of the labor market. As a young person, I might work informally, get some maybe human capital, then try to enter the formal dependent employment, then eventually try to basically become self-employed informally, and then if I'm successful enough and grow enough, I might end up actually as a formal self-employed. So there are various models of the labor market. This one assumes that the labor market is essentially integrated, and I freely choose where I locate over my working life. And then going back to Tokman and Fields, we can say the informal labor market is actually heterogeneous, is, if you like, segmented by itself. So at the lower end of the informal labor market, I can freely enter. There are no barriers. But the very good jobs in the informal sector, they are rationed. So, for example, selling hats on the Roman beach, not everybody can do this. But washing dishes in a Roman restaurant, everybody can do, right? And so this, just as a silly example of what we mean by the existence of a lower tier that is free entry and an upper tier that is rationed. Now, there are some people, and this, Kanbur in particular, and also Ostrom, when she was alive, they were not very happy with, they were quite critical of this dichotomous view of labor markets in developing countries along the formal-informal divide. So for them, formal and informal are sort of metaphors that depend very much on the context. And basically this strand of the literature puts policy at the center. What matters are policies that improve workers' lives, whether they are formal or informal. So Ostrom did quite a lot of stuff of the policy of the commons, saying that if informal arrangements of how to use common assets have worked very well in some societies, it's silly of the state to enter and try to formalize these things. This might be actually counterproductive. So, but I still think that, looking at these three main paradigms is a valuable thing to do. Now let's look at empirical, the empirical literature. So basically, what a lot of studies do, they just look at wage gaps between formal and informal segments of the labor market, and and of course one of the big issues is whether people select themselves voluntarily into the informal or the formal sector. The other point is that there are always selection issues in the sense that if you find a wage gap, a negative wage gap for people who are informally employed, maybe they just have worse characteristics than people who are with similar observable characteristics in the formal sector. So by controlling for this, so people have done a lot of work with fixed effects regressions. You might, this gap might be actually eliminated. Another procedure to look, another way to look at another method, now I found the word, another method to look at whether the labor market is segmented or not, is to look at transition probability matrices between labor market states, where you have informal, formal, unemployment, whatever. So you basically divide the labor market into, if you have data, into the informal and the formal sector, and you see how do these flows basically take place. We'll have an example of this later. Anyway, let me just say, the slide essentially says that the literature is, when it comes to non-transition countries, is mixed as far as wage gaps or as far as the transitions are concerned. So, so here are some papers on transition countries. So, Paches and Stampini, they find high mobility from informal and formal salaried jobs, little mobility between self-employed and formal salaried jobs. While Bernabé Stampini, there is support for segmentation in Georgia. There seems to be a preference for formal employment over informal work, which, at least in the Georgian case, seems to serve as a buffer in recessions. I mean, this is one of the big themes, of course, whether informal employment basically increases during recessions or not. But we don't address, you know, I'm not interested in this, if you like, macro topic here. Now, basically what we find in the Ukrainian case, with the same data, Norberto Pignati and I, is that there is, and this is also found by many, by the World Bank study on informal employment in Latin America, that if you look at salaried workers, there's a lot of indication for segmentation, or there seems to be segmentation, while for the self-employed, the informal self-employed, the picture is complex. In the sense that the majority wants to leave the sector and wants to actually enter formal dependent employment, but there are wage premia throughout the hourly earnings distribution. And then with Angelika Zaitseva, I did a paper on Russia, where we, using fixed effects quantile regressions, we find evidence for an integrated labor market for Russia, which is in line with the work of Fabian Slonimczyk and Vladimir Gimpelson, who use actually transition analysis. Okay, so that was a brief purview of the literature on informality. Now, the literature on risk attitudes and labor outcomes. Again, none of this is complete. You know, these are just selected papers. But basically, we have, I mean, the first or the second bullet point here, basically people have done work on looking at the determinants of risk attitudes. And again, these are risk attitudes essentially self-assessed by people, by respondents in surveys. But we find, I mean, Domen et al. Did this for Germany, and Thomas Domen and I and Norberto did this for Ukraine. We find, and this is true for many countries, I think, that basically gender, age, parents, education are very important. These are exogenous, if you like, determinants of your risk attitudes. And you know, so it's always found that women tend to be less risk-loving than men. Older people are less risk-loving, and if your parents have higher education, you tend to be willing to take more risks than if your parents have less education. Now, there is a literature on risk attitudes and selection into self-employment and entrepreneurship. This was by Brown et al., Caliendo et al. For Germany, Eklund et al. For Sweden, I think. And Jankov did work on Russia, not using risk attitudes, but using another measure of risk-taking, finding that entrepreneurs in Russia are more risk-taking than non-entrepreneurs. While some World Bank guys, Demel, McKenzie, and Woodruff, did not find a relationship between risk attitudes and returns to capital. Now, there's a literature on risk and occupational choice. So a nice paper by Delir and Levy shows that single parents, when you have dependent children, you're less likely to work in occupations with high fatality risk. So this is a very general way to look at this. But there are some papers that actually use direct measures of risk and link that to occupation. So there is a correlation between workers' willingness to take risks and the earnings risk of their chosen occupation. Okay, so essentially workers who are more willing to take risks profit from working in more risky occupations that pay a risk premium. So Domen et Falk, this is AAR 2011, in a lag experiment, they show a positive effect of stated risk preference on the probability of self-selecting into a more variable payment scheme. So using the same ULMS data as in this paper, as Skryabikova et al., look at risk attitudes and sorting into occupations. More risk-loving people select into more risky occupations. Now, the contribution of the paper is actually that we incorporate direct risk measures in the study of the informal labor market, and we establish, I think, that risk attitudes matter for selection into labor market states along the formal-informal divide. And so this discussion might help in basically shedding more lights on this issue of segmentation versus integration in developing, in this case, in transition countries. We show that people who are more willing to take risk are confronted with a larger variance in residual earnings, larger individual deviations from the mean of residual earnings. And we link search behavior of the unemployed across several employment states with the willingness to take risk. I mean, again, this is very preliminary there. Now, what is definitely true is that we employ a unique survey in Ukraine, the ULMS, which allows us to study job histories, informality, and risk measures. So the ULMS is actually a better data set for this than the RLMS, because the RLMS does not allow you to really construct a complete history of job history of people, while the ULMS does. I will talk about this, the history of the ULMS a little bit in a second. So essentially, when I went to Ukraine in 2000, people tried to work on labor markets, but there were no data, or the data from from Dzierżkomstat, as it's called, were not very good. So actually, I decided to be Angel Gabriel, let's say, basically, so what we did, we got together with John Earl, Jan Svejna, Klara Saberianova, all those people who worked on the Russian labor market and had some experience with a survey. And I got Klaus Zimmermann, who is was at the time the director of IZA, to actually finance the first two waves of the ULMS in 2003 and 2004. Then it's very difficult. I mean, if you take a hat and walk around and say, I want to get money for a survey, people say, who cares, Ukraine, who cares about this? So it's really very, very difficult. And so essentially, in 2007, I had a European project. In 2012, I had a World Bank project. And because of that, we were able to collect these data. So you might wonder why we have these gaps here. The gaps are because, again, going around with a hat is quite frustrating. Now, our main focus here is on 2007 and 2012. Here we have basically the same risk module that was inserted in the German SUB included. Okay, so the data can be linked into a panel of individuals. The job history goes back until 1986. Actually, a complete history goes back to 1997 because we have this retrospective part. And we have informality questions. We only have in the reference weeks, basically, in 2003, 4, 7, and 12. Okay, so let me skip this. Of course, there's quite a lot of attrition. Actually, when we did this World Bank thing in 2012, we filled up the panel. it really has a lot of information on the labor market, and also there's a lot of stuff on household, on education. It's definitely one of the most complete surveys in the transition region. Okay, so what interests us though here is, on the one hand, is soliciting answers on informal, dependent and self-employment. So we have informal wage employment. You will see the question in a minute. So non-registration of contract, voluntary or involuntary wage employment. So whether I, as a worker, did not want to register or my activity, or whether actually my employer did not want to register it, or whether both didn't want. And then informal employment is basically not registration of activity. So basically the questions capturing this is for employees, tell me please, are you officially registered at this job? That is, are you on a work roster, work agreement, or contract? And of course you could argue that people are not really willing to reveal this, but basically the survey is done by the International Institute, Sociological Institute in Kiev, with Vladimir Panyoto as a director, and so they have all these interviewers who have very good relations with these people. So we think, well, actually the results are also indicating that people do say normally the truth. So registered, if you say registered, you're formal, and if you're not registered, you're informal. And then why aren't you officially registered? So employer does not want to register. I do not want to register. Both, we didn't want to register. Of course, you have all these theories that say I might want to work informally, I get a higher wage. I mean, there is some evidence for Latin America, certainly, that people don't trust the pension system. They think they will never get a pension if they pay in, so they prefer to be informal and get a higher wage, for example. Anyway, self-employed, is your activity registered? Yes, you're formal. You're formal self-employed. No, you're not. Okay. Now, let me say this. Of course, we did a paper with Angelika Zaitseva about Russia, where we show, and actually also Rostislav Kapelushnikov did a paper in Russian that shows the same thing, that the incidence of informal employment depends crucially on what kind of definition you use. Okay, so we use here, so you get basically from 8% to 30% informal employment, depending on what kind of definition you use. So basically, we look here at the primary job, which is the job where you earn most. It's not where you necessarily have your labor book, but where you earn most. Also, because in Ukraine, at least according to the ULMS, to the survey, the share of those who have a secondary job is very small. Okay, so we don't. So by just looking at the primary job, I think we're okay here. Okay, so this basically is the overview of informality definition in the data. So registered, wage employment, you're formal, self-employment, you're formal, unregistered, you're informal, obviously, and there we make a distinction between involuntary informal, not informal, but informal, and voluntary informal. Yeah? I mean, again, these are, if you like, maybe crude distinctions, but still they tell us quite a lot, I think. Now, in the survey there are various measures of risk attitudes. So we have subjective risk measures, and those subjective risk measures on which we concentrate here will either talk about, in general, are you, you will see the question in a minute, what person are you? But it also, there are also questions relating to specific life domains, like career, financial matters, health, car driving, and sports and leisure. Actually, Domen and Al have done lots of work on this, showing that the general risk measure is the best measure to correlates best with many life outcomes, while the domain-specific ones only correlate well with the specific domain. We have also objective risk measures, hypothetical investment questions, and there are lotteries. Now here we focus on the first one. So you might, okay, so this is these are basically the questions, so they're very known, I think. So how do you see yourself? Are you generally a person who's fully willing to take risk, or you do try to avoid taking risk? Please give a number from 0 to 10, where 0 means completely unwilling to take risks, and the value 10 means completely willing to take risks. You can take values between and so on. Okay, now, and then it's also about life domains. Now, again, you might say, if you incentivize this, you might get very different results. But actually, when people get paid for what they bet on, maybe the situation is different. So in the case not of the ULMS, because we hadn't money for this, but we will do it eventually with the next wave I want to do. In case of the German socioeconomic panel, there has been an experimental validation of the general risk question. Basically saying that there is a great correspondence between what people say and the outcome in the experiment. So if you're interested in this, you should read this paper by Domen et al., 2011. I mean, I don't have time now to go over this. But essentially, it's an experiment where it's a lottery experiment where you have a lottery of getting 0 or 300 euros, I think, something like this. And, depending on how risk-loving or risk-averse you are, you have an earlier or later switching point where you switch to the safe to the safe option, which is basically the average of 300 and 0. Now let's look at risk attitudes in Ukraine in 2007. If you take all respondents, they're very risk averse. And of course, when you think about the turmoil that happened in Ukraine, especially economic turmoil, this is all before the events with Crimea and Donbass and so on. So we're not getting to that period. You can see that, if you compare this to Germany or to the US, people are much more risk averse in Ukraine than they are in Germany. Actually, if you look at employed people, the situation looks a bit more normal in the sense that the mode is actually 5, which is also the case in Germany. Anyhow, so this is just to, what interests us in particular is if you look at the general risk index by employment category in Ukraine. And basically the black one is formal employment. And basically what this tells us already is that people who are more risk-loving tend to select themselves more into informal employment. Okay? But also into formal self-employment, I should say that. Now here, actually, I checked this so I will say not that you can't read the numbers, but you actually can read them, because I can read them. So So they're, huh? No, maybe from the back you can't read them as well as I can read them from the front. But I think you can read them though. And I mean the main, let's just look at all. And the main message is clearly that the formally employed have a much lower average risk measure than the people who are voluntary informal or involuntary, even those who are involuntary informal. Of course, the formally self-employed have a very high average, as do the informally self-employed. So let me now turn to, I mean, again, of course I could talk longer about this table, but since you might claim in the back you can see it, I won't. There is one interesting point that we haven't pursued yet that much, and that is if you look at men versus women, actually there is a big difference between voluntary informal and involuntary informal, not for men, but actually for women. So for women this works perfectly, so to speak. No? So, I mean, because if you are involuntary, if you're pushed into informal employment, this should not have anything to do, if you like, with your risk attitudes. No? While if you're voluntary there, you would think that there is a correlation. Yeah? And you can see it clearly in the case of... but what we can see, though, is that if you compare this to formal employment, it's clear that all other labor market states, people tend to be more risk-loving. Yeah? Okay. Now, so basically we do two types of models where we want to establish whether there is a correlation for a start. Of course, what we would like is a causal relation, and we do some tests for reverse causality, and we don't find reverse causality. So we take this as some evidence that there is a causal relationship from risk to selecting into a labor market state. And because of course you could argue that if you are in the for a long time informal, what you report when you're asked, are you risk averse, or what is your relationship to risk taking? You might, because your experience of informal employment shows that there's something risky, you might report that you have a higher proclivity than if you did. But we do show that this is not the case. Okay. Anyway, so also what is important, and what I don't have time to discuss, is that there is actually a lot of measurement error in the risk in the risk attitudes measure. So, for example, Domen et al. Have done this for Germany, where they take basically a subset of people 2 weeks after they, filled out, they responded. And you would expect, and they only take people where there was no life event, any kind of dramatic life event, somebody died in the family, or I got a divorce, or whatever, so no life-changing event. But still, when you ask people, what is your risk, what is your risk attitude, they don't give the same number they gave 2 weeks before. I mean, there is, in relative terms, it's stable, but people don't give the same number. So you would argue that these risk measures have some measurement error, and you should try to instrument this. Now, the only way we do this at the moment is we instrumented the 2007 risk measure, we instrument with the 2012 measure. As you will see, there is some evidence of measurement error, but because the coefficients go up, but they're not significant. So risk attitudes 2012 are not a good instrument, and they're still looking for that. Okay, anyway, so to establish whether there's a relationship between risk attitudes and informal employment, positive relationship, we run Probit models, then we run linear probability models because that way we can do IV. But we also look at multinomial logic models where we have different states, four different employment states. Yeah? And basically on the right-hand side we have risk attitudes plus a lot of controlling covariates. Okay. All right. So here we have our Probit analysis. And there are different specifications. So, for example, if whether you were informal in 2003 or 2004, we add, or whether you were non-employed, not unemployed, but non-employed, between 2004 and 2007. We also look at adjusted household income, and education, whether you're married, in a register of married, number of children, whether you're Ukrainian, female, age and age squared. And what interests us is, of course, the willingness to take a risk. And I mean, no matter what the specification, you do get a quite strong, basically, correlation between willing to take risk and entering informal or being in informal employment in 2007. Yeah? Now, it's also true if you do this for 2012, if you pool the data, you get weaker results because the 2012 data are weaker. All right. Now, I mean, this is my linear probability model where I get exactly the same results with the OLS. When I use the ID sample, yeah?
All informal employment?
Yeah, this is all informal employment.
Why not only the voluntary?
No, that will come.
Ah, okay.
In a multinomial logic.
Ah, okay.
No, you could do that too, but we
yes,
do it
because you would expect that risk attitudes, if it's involuntary, it's not due to your attitudes.
Of course, if it's involuntary, you're pushed into it.
Yes.
That's the point. But we come to that in the next. I did say. Sorry. Here, multinomial logic models, where the dependent variable has now 5 alternatives. Yeah.
Yes, but why not also do that already in the linear models?
Well, you could, yeah. But so you should get a stronger.
Yes,
you should get a stronger result, but you have a lot less observations, because again, you see. So here you see that this is the number of people who are in the category. So the formally employed are, of course, by far the largest category. Then you have voluntary informal, okay, and you have involuntary informal, which are more.
So one thing you could do is, for example, in your regression, your linear regression, when you have the risk variable, also interacted with voluntary. And that interaction should be positive. And then you're going to say degrees of freedom and all that stuff. And
let's see. Yeah, sure.
And then you should do it directly in the regression.
You should be more. You should select yourself more into.
Yes.
Of course,
yes.
but we will see. But you can also do this with the multinomial logic.
Yeah, okay.
It's the same thing. So it's already a long paper, and it will never finish. We started in 2011 or 12 or something. So, well, but that's because of Melanie Kamis broke her back in New York City and wasn't able to do anything and whatever. There were lots of reasons. We had all these other papers to do. Okay. Anyway, so let me go back to the OLS ID sample, which is obviously smaller because in 2012, not everybody who reports or let's say the numbers of people that report risk attitudes in 2012 are different from the people who reported in 2007, or there is not a perfect overlap. Again, we get similar results here, but and we do get actually higher coefficients, as you can see, with the IV, but they're not significant, right? So this is a big issue or problem. Okay, so now here we come to your point, and you can. I mean, it's not that obvious, but you can see that. I mean, this is formal self-employment. This is formal self-employment. Sorry, no, because this is involuntary. This is voluntary dependent employment, and this is informal self-employment. No? And you can see that there is a difference clearly. Actually, when you do it for 2012, the involuntary becomes insignificant, while the others are strongly significant. But even though, it's difficult because the numbers are small compared to the big category, which are the full, the formal dependent employees. But still, I mean, the results are quite good in the sense that they say that people who are involuntary have a lower correlation with risk than people who are in formal self-employment. We know that formal self-employed have a higher propensity for risk, but also those who are voluntary, and also the informal self-employed. Yeah. So in a way, this sort of is the same what you want to do. You probably would get a similar. Maybe it's a good thing to do nevertheless. We should. Yeah. Good. That's a good point. So basically, we do a wage regression for 3 occupational groups that dominate informal employment. And we do it for everybody apart from managers. So let's look at, let's look at, so this is a PowerPoint presentation in a PowerPoint presentation, which I like. Okay, so you can see here, so informal employees, you can see that basically, let's say unskilled occupations, skilled manual workers, and service workers, shops and market sales, and also technicians and associate professionals. No, sorry, let me get it right. So we have service workers and shops and market sales. That has a high incidence of informal.
Yes.
We have skilled manual workers, and we have unskilled occupations. So we basically do 2 regressions. One with only those 3 occupations, and one with everybody but managers, because managers are not informal ever. No? Okay, so now let me get out of this. Okay, so we save the residuals from these regressions, and then we get the means of residual earnings for the 3 different states and regress the absolute difference in the individual residual to the mean residual earnings on risk attitudes. And we do this for OLS and IV. So since I don't have a lot of time, so let me just look at this with OLS, a full sample. So again, we get a positive correlation, if you like, between the risk index and the variability, or the width of the residual earnings distribution. Okay. So this gels well with all this literature on risk attitudes and occupational choice, in a way. Yeah. All right. So let's forget about this. So let me briefly talk about transition probabilities in the short and medium run. And let me just finish with that, actually. Basically, by analyzing short and medium-term transitions between labor market states, one can infer preferred destination states, especially if one has longer panels. Since we have data that span several years, we can use simple Markovian transitions without the pitfalls of short panels. I mean, people, and this is what this quote from Lehmann and Pignati says, people have normally only 2-year panels, and they have all kinds of they all use all kinds of advanced techniques to mimic sort of a steady state situation. Now, if you have a longer panel, you don't need to do all these strange transformations. You can just look at what do these transition probabilities look like. Okay. Now, so this is how you calculate this. The duration in the state is basically 1 minus the complement of remaining in the state. Okay. Now, these are the short-term transition. I should also say, of course, you can have a lot of attrition. Or you could also have round tripping, which means people appear again in a state, but they actually were in other states over the period. Actually, we eliminate round trippers, which are not many in this case. So let's look at the medium term transitions. Again, basically, my diagonal elements tell me what states are desirable and what states are not. And the data make quite a bit of sense, in the sense that formal salaried employment, this is formal salaried employment, formal self-employment, and informal self-employment seem to be relatively desirable states, because more than half of the people are still in this state after this quite long period. And again, there's no round tripping, and since we know the labor market history of people, people did not change labor market states here. Okay? While, and this is interesting, that if you look at, for example, informal voluntary, a big chunk of them actually enters formal salaried employment, right? So all the people who for a while entered informal employment, the real state they want to get in is always formal salaried employment, basically. Yeah. Now. Okay, so let me just come. So let me just say this, and then come to the conclusions. And then, my watch says I'm 2 minutes, not 1. So whatever. Anyway, so basically we have 3 states that seem desirable states: formal salaried employment, formal self-employment, and informal self-employment. And informal salaried employment, whether voluntary or involuntary, are both not desirable states. You don't want to stay there. I mean, if you're more risk-loving, you enter there. You enter into voluntarily into it, but that's because you don't have any other options. So in a way, the issue of voluntary, of course, the way we defined it, we say I didn't want to register. So, right? Anyway, this is so informal salaried employment and whether voluntary or involuntary are not desirable states. Also, a large part of those originally in voluntary informal and involuntary informal search for a formal salaried job and successfully enter that state. But there is a substantial minority that actually ends up in involuntary informal employment. Okay. So let me now just. I mean, this I don't want to talk about, but this is interesting. So because these transition probability matrices make us think that people who are more risk-loving behave differently when they are in the state of unemployment, and they search for employment. Okay, so so we want to investigate this, but the picture isn't that simple as we won't see, because we don't have time to look at that. So let me just. So this is what again, I also don't want to talk about reverse causality, but we don't find reverse causality. So even though we don't claim this is everything here is causal, I think it's interesting for two reasons. Because nobody has done this before, linking risk attitudes, again, that have been validated not in Ukraine but in Germany, with informal employment. On the other hand, we don't find reverse causality, so there is some evidence, if you like, that we can talk about a causal effect. So I won't stop, I'll just go through the tentative conclusions. Anyway, so maybe I should... Okay, so risk attitudes are an important determinant for selection into informal employment relationships. And the link between risk attitudes and selection points to an integrated labor market for many of the Ukrainian workers, and not only for the self-employed. Now, risk actually plays an important or as important role in these regressions as age, household income, while of course, I should say, while gender, education, and job history play a larger role. So risk is not that important, but it is as important as age and household income. Okay, so let me just finish here. Okay.
Brief ones.
Yes, very short.
Well, come on, we can eat a bit later. It doesn't matter, does it?
Okay.
You don't have to be too rigid. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I had a question about this informal unemployment, and if there is any punishment related to the position in this informal market you have. For instance, if you have this job with an income and you are not required to pay taxes because it is informal, if they discover you, if you have some form of punishment on the side of the employer and on the side of the employee. Because if there is, this can affect obviously the way in which they reply to the question. Okay, this is one. And the second, yes, do you have any do you have any idea about what is the level of income of these involuntary jobs? Just to understand also what is the risk as related to the utility which could come from
of course.
them.
Yeah.
And the last curiosity, if you could say something about these large differences between women and men, and if you can elaborate a little bit on your further results on this, or if you do not have any other elements in this respect.
Okay, well, that's a hard question, but no, I can.
But take what you want, then we can discuss. Take what you want.
I think, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, there certainly are penalties for firms when they get, when they get caught. Whether there are penalties for workers, I'm not so sure. I mean, the main penalty is that you immediately lose your job if they detect you. No? So that's now we did some when we looked at this residual earnings. Actually, you do have slightly higher wages for voluntary informal employees than for formal employees, and for the average. I'm talking about averages, and the informal employment. Now let me look. Sorry, let me go to one. This is not part of this paper, but we did a paper here where you can check, where you can see that, which is quite interesting actually. I didn't have time to talk about this, but these are quantile regressions, fixed effects quantile regressions, where you basically control for time invariant unobserved heterogeneity. And the point is, you can see that there is actually, this is relative to formal employment, salaried employment. No? So you can see that there is a premium across the distribution for voluntary informal, where there is actually a penalty for voluntary informal. So that's actually quite strong result. While for both self-employed formal and self-employed informal, there are premia that are quite large. So nevertheless, the self-employed informal still line up to get a formal job. So basically, wages is not everything. The fact that you feel secure, you have a permanent job, is well, it's everywhere important, but certainly in a country where you had a lot of turmoil, that's what you're trying to get. Anyway, so this, I hope, answers your second question. Your third question, I wouldn't know to answer on the spot.
I'm just wondering, can you observe when workers change their employment status?
You can.
Can.
You can, yeah. No, you can. Sorry, I should say you can observe basically information on informality. You only have, this question: have you a job, a contract or not? You can only observe in the reference week. But what you can observe is whether people change jobs between reference weeks. So what I'm saying is, when people enter informal employment, they don't rapidly go out of it. At least because that you could see whether they changed jobs, but you cannot observe whether when they change a job, you cannot observe whether it's from a formal to an informal. So it's so there is definitely some measurement problem. But since this is on the left side, a dependent variable, and you still get always significant results, so you're okay there.
Yeah, I thought okay. They change the employment status and how they respond to this question. So how does it change their risk attitudes?
Well, the point is you observe, you ask them, what is your job now? So I don't see why that would change your answer. I think what Paula said is more relevant if they're worried that the government goes after them. But again, the people from the Sociological Institute try, of course, to convince them this is completely anonymized, nobody will ever find out, of course. Yeah. But you never, but again, there's measurement error, but despite that, you get a significant correlation, I should say, or even a causal effect, if you like. Yeah.
Do you know the reason why they are informal? In Belgium, the main reason would be I want to escape the good government. I do not want to pay my taxes. I don't want to pay my social security contributions. But in Russia or in Ukraine, in many cases you want to escape the bad government. You don't want to arrest by some corrupt politician that basically extorts you, or that makes you pay things you don't have to pay, or that basically tries to capture you. And that's very different, and there could be some regional variation in that. So
yeah, but okay, so you can tell different stories why, for example, I don't want to become a formal self-employed.
yes, indeed.
But I mean, there's a large literature that looks at self-employment and risk attitudes that always finds this positive correlation, which we find here. Now, you could argue that you know, if you're more risk-loving, you basically take into account the risk that can confront you if you you know, if you formalize, right?
So there, what I'm saying is, maybe you have in your sample two kinds of effects, and you see the average effect. One effect is indeed I'm risk loving, and that's why I let's not try to pay taxes and not do any social security stuff, and I get away with it. But another way is actually, if I'm going informal, I'm avoiding risk. I'm risk averse, because I saw many companies in Russia early on that, as a strategy of risk avoidance, kept below the radar to avoid a predatory government. And it would be cool if you have some variation in local government, because then the sign should be, the effect should not be there, or the opposite sign in those places where the government is very predatory.
Well, we can look at oblast level variation, not more. So, but again, yeah. So that's a different project, though, for sure. I mean, you know, no, we should do it together. Yeah, since you're about that stuff. No, that's a good. So you know, so you get something out of my talk, and I get something out. I get a lot out of my talk, of course. Anyway, yeah, no. So that's a good point, but that's a different. Actually, we should put this into the new survey when. Okay, very good.
Okay, I think we have a time for the one last question.
Not John.
Thank you. I was going to ask what Kun asked already, but I had another question. So, as someone doing research on tax evasion, I'm interested in correlation between compliance and quality of institutions in general, because that's a big factor affecting compliance worldwide. And I was wondering if, when you were doing your survey, you ask people how they assess risk of being caught for tax evasion, for example. Like, do they think, because, you know, low quality of institution means that the risk of you being caught, unless you are Maidan activist or something, is actually low. And I wonder how people perceive this risk. If they don't do the compliance, if they are employed informally because they think they are not going to be caught. Or because,
no, but I mean, the problem with this is that you solicit basically cautiousness on the part of respondents. You know, so if you ask these very detailed questions about how do you, can you be, what do you think, can you be caught or not, you will then when the question comes, or so I mean, you know, it would be, I mean, they wouldn't probably not answer it.
That's true.
So, or if you ask that before you ask the registration question, then they, you know, because they're alerted now to this.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Hartmut, many thanks for your lecture.